Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing the 2025 Calder Trophy race. This is the award given out every single year to the NHL's best rookie player. In the past, the Sharks haven't really been involved much in the Calder conversation. This is because the Sharks were previously a really great team, and when you are a great team, you draft late in the first round or even trade away your draft picks entirely, and so there's not necessarily a lot of quality young talent moving through your system and making it to the NHL. However, on occasion, the Sharks have managed to have that type of player. In 2011, Logan Couture was the runner-up for the Calder Trophy behind Carolina Hurricanes' Jeff Skinner. And then in 2001, the Sharks actually won the Calder off the back of a great rookie season from goaltender Evgeny Nabokov. These days, the Sharks are expected to be more so involved for this particular award because the Sharks have been a lot worse as of late. And because of that, they start drafting much higher. This past season, in fact, the Sharks had the first overall pick for the first time in franchise history, grabbing Macklin Celebrini, who unsurprisingly is a very real threat of winning the Calder this season. So the question that we will be asking in this video, is he currently the front runner? Now, at the moment, there are essentially 4 players who are still involved in this Calder race: Matvei Michkov, Dustin Wolf, Hutson, and Macklin Celebrini. There are obviously some other rookies here that are on kind of the outskirts, Tsiplikov, Stankoven, or the Sharks' very own Will Smith, but it would take a crazy run over the last 25 odd games for them to even insert themselves into this conversation. So realistically, it's going to come down to these 4 players. As we know, however, every NHL award, or pretty much most NHL awards, will have 3 nominees, not 4. And so one of these players will have to find themselves on the outside looking in by the time this season concludes. And currently, it does seem to be pointing towards Philadelphia Flyers forward Matvei Michkov. And it's pretty crazy to say that because back at the beginning of the season, he had quickly asserted himself as a front runner for this particular award. During the month of October, he was the NHL's Rookie of the Month. He was about a point per game, and considering Macklin Celebrini was injured during this time, there didn't seem to be many players who were going to contest him for this title. And yet Michkov, as of late, has fallen off considerably. And I'm not just talking about a small sample size of 5 or 6 games, but over his last 28 games, he has just 9 points. And this is obviously bad considering just the lack of production. But on top of that, as you would expect from most young 20-year-old rookies making it into the NHL, if they're not scoring, they're not putting up goals and points, they're not exactly providing a lot to your team. Michkov is a relatively one-dimensional player currently, and on top of that, Michkov is also a very risky player who loves to try and create offense by cheating a little bit out of his own zone, and he has run into trouble because of that as of late. You go back a few weeks, there was a semi-famous moment in an Islanders game between them and the Flyers where Michkov cheats a little bit out of the D zone, leaves an Islanders player open who ends up scoring immediately, like 2 seconds later, which then leads to a screaming match between Michkov and Tortorella on the bench. That's Flyers head coach John Tortorella, and that happened at about the halfway mark of the second period. Michkov did not see another second of ice time for the rest of that game. Even somewhat recently, just a couple of games before the Four Nations break, the Flyers played up against the Washington Capitals. This was one of Michkov's better games as of late. He scored 2 goals during it, and yet on that first goal, we see him completely cheat out of the defensive zone, goes to float around in the neutral zone, leaves his team defending 4-on-5 in essentially now a penalty-killing situation while the Capitals had full control of the puck. Luckily for him, the Capitals player takes a shot, it gets blocked, the Flyers regain possession and work it out immediately to Michkov, who then goes down for the breakaway and scores, so no harm, no foul. But the fact is that could have backfired. If that puck ends up in the back of their net, Tortorella looks up and he sees his future star player just floating in the neutral zone, not involved in the play at all. It's not a great look. And so when you're cheating for offense, but that offense isn't existing, it's hard to really build up trust as a player. And we have seen that over the 28 games. There are moments where Michkov is getting 17, 18 plus minutes of time on ice. And then there are many games as well where he struggles to even hit a dozen minutes, where there are multiple times where he's hit less than 10 minutes of ice time in these games. And so this up and down, inconsistent level of play, it currently has him, in my opinion, as that 4th place finish for the Calder Trophy right now. With that being said, however, Michkov, even through this cold streak, still finds himself just 4 points behind Celebrini for second in rookie scoring and only 5 points behind Hudson in that race as well. He has 55 games played, 16 goals, 20 assists for 36 points. And one of the primary reasons and sort of, I guess, excuses, so to speak, for why Michkov has slowed down as of late is a sort of mental tiredness, a fatigue that you would also sort of expect from a young rookie making their NHL debut. And so, with this 2-week break for the Four Nations face-off, there is a possibility that Michkov could come out of this break looking like he did back at the beginning of the season. He certainly has the offensive capabilities and the offensive talent to just absolutely light it up if he really gets rolling. And so, because that point gap is as small as it currently is, Michkov could roar back and suddenly find himself second or perhaps even first, and that puts him definitely back into that top 3. But right now, I just don't see it. Next, we have Dustin Wolf of the Calgary Flames. Now, Wolf is in a bit of an interesting spot because being a goaltender, it's not really an apples-to-apples comparison like it would be between, let's say, Michkov and Celebrini, where you can go, okay, he has this amount of goals, and then he has this amount of goals. For Wolf, an entirely different stat sheet. Now, back at the beginning of the season, it didn't seem as though Wolf would have much of a chance at the Calder, and the reason for that is that when it comes to rookie forwards and defensemen, they're pretty much expected to play every single game during a season, barring any sort of injuries, obviously. But even the best of the best goaltenders don't play every single game, and most of the time these days they're not hitting the 70s either. They'll play the 60s, maybe most starters though will be in the 50s in terms of games played. However, over the first half of this season, during the Calgary Flames' first 40 games, Dustin Wolf had only started 21 of them, with their backup Dan Vladar having played 19. That put Dustin Wolf on pace for just about 44 games started this season, not nearly enough to actually prove himself as a starting goaltender, which is necessary to actually get the Calder Trophy. But during the second half, he has started to play a lot more. The Flames have put a lot more faith into him, and he has delivered by being the NHL's Rookie of the Month during January. Now, in the last few games prior to the Four Nations break, he started to fall off a little bit, and that has put his stats more so in the 15th-ish range in the NHL, which is certainly still not too bad. It's important to point out that, for instance, there are 48 goaltenders who have played at least 20 games this season, so Wolf is in the upper third of that group, which is quite solid for a rookie goaltender, but he will probably have to improve those numbers a little bit if he wants a real chance of winning. On top of that, Wolf is kind of held to a bit of a different standard, unfortunately for him, than a Michkov or a Hutson or a Celebrini. Those players, you're kind of just looking at what they're able to do individually, not necessarily take into account what the team is doing. For Dustin Wolf, I imagine a big sort of bar that he's going to need to clear is getting his team into a playoff position. Currently, the Flames are just 3 points out of a playoff spot, and this is heavily exceeding the expectations coming into the year. Most people thought the Calgary Flames would be a basement-dwelling bottom 5 team. I even saw some preseason predictions that had them below the San Jose Sharks in the standings. And while there are, of course, other reasons for why the Flames have done as well as they have this season, other players who have outperformed expectations, Dustin Wolf is a key piece of this Calgary Flames team. And so, if they are able to make the playoffs, that will heavily increase his chances of managing to win the Calder because of the fact that, as you would expect, a goaltender plays a huge role in where a team actually ends up finishing in the standings. If he misses out, even if just by a few points, I don't quite know if he'll get there. For instance, the last goaltender to win the Calder Trophy was Steve Mason back in 2009. Obviously, he had great goalie stats for sure, but a big reason that got him the trophy was that he was able to lead the Columbus Blue Jackets to a historic first ever playoff appearance. It won't be as historic for the case of Wolf, because of course the Flames have made the playoffs in the past, but it would still be such an extreme outperformance that it would definitely give Wolf a very real chance if he can bring his stats up back a little bit to be that first place. But considering right now they are on the outside looking in, and I don't know if they'll be able to sneak into that second wildcard spot, I have Wolf as a nominee, but in third place. That brings us now to our top 2 players, Lane Hutson and Macklin Celebrini. I imagine most people who you would ask would kind of go between these 2 players. Maybe some would say Wolf has that outside chance, as I mentioned, but realistically, it's either Hutson or it's Celebrini. Now, me being, of course, a biased Sharks fan, most likely, I would lean more so towards Macklin Celebrini, and I'll tell you why as we come to the comparisons between these 2 players. Starting off, Lane Hutson, an incredible player for sure, very dynamic, dynamic. He moves exceptionally well. When players come to attack him at the blue line, he's able to evade them easily, create a ton of space for himself in the offensive zone. He also holds on to the puck very well in the offensive zone, moves around, tires out opposing teams' defenders, and then opens those passing lanes to create grade A shooting opportunities. Good vision as a player. There's a lot to like from an offensive perspective when it comes to Lane Hutson. Same goes for Macklin Celebrini. Maybe there's something in the water at Boston University, but he plays a very similar style of game where he uses his edge work and his skating to really be able to just abuse opposing teams' defenders. He's got that great vision as well, holds onto the puck, is able to attack the middle of the ice, carry pucks into the zone more often than most players do with his controlled entries per game this season, but he also knows when to attack the net, when he has to hang back a little bit in the offensive zone, and when he has to move closer in to get a good scoring chance for himself. So that hockey IQ is also off the charts for Celebrini. But where the difference, I would say, comes in between these two players is on the other side of the puck defensively. Celebrini, his defensive game, it's not extremely developed. It's not as though he's winning any Selke trophies this season. He's not the best of the best defensive forwards in the NHL, but as an 18-year-old coming in with the type of effort that he has is so impressive. Most of the time when an 18 or a 19-year-old forward makes their debut in the NHL, it's because they're so talented offensively that they can still manage to score and outscore any potential mistakes that they will make, because defensively they'll still need a couple of years to develop. The same sort of case exists for Celebrini, where you are going to need a couple seasons to develop defensively, but the fact that he is committed to getting better, the fact that he is coming back in his own zone, he's that third player out, he'll come below the goal line, he'll fight for pucks along the boards, it means he is so much already above most other previous first overall picks. If you think McDavid, you think Jack Hughes, you think Connor Bedard just last season, Celebrini is a step above them when it comes to his defensive style of play. On the face-off circle as well, this is an aspect that Celebrini shines in too. He is 49% on the dot, that this might not seem all that impressive. Oh, he's losing more faceoffs than he's winning. But in comparison to every previous first overall pick centerman since Sidney Crosby 20 years ago, Celebrini has the highest face-off percentage by a pretty decent margin. So again, it speaks to the idea that Celebrini does not want any weaknesses in his game. Every single piece of play here in the NHL, he wants to be bringing it up to an elite level. A rising tide raises all ships in the case for Macklin Celebrini. On the other side of the coin, when it comes to Lane Hutson, his beginning of the season defensively was a big struggle. October, November, he did not look particularly good, still trying to find his footing in the NHL, and I think most Montreal Canadiens fans would agree with that. Having said that, he has improved quite a bit over these last couple of months. He hasn't necessarily been great or even necessarily good, but he's been a lot more serviceable, a lot better in his own zone. However, a reputation is quite difficult to shake in the NHL, and especially on paper, with Lane Hutson being that smaller statured defenseman, not a very strong player, he kind of just on paper looks like someone who wouldn't be all that great in his own zone. And it's important to point out that this is not an award that is given off of a strict objective stats. It is not an AI program that is deciding who is the best rookie, but instead, at least it was the case last year, 194 media members who will not be watching every single second of Lane Hutson and Macklin Celebrini's game, and instead will be depending on what little they may have seen, as well as what other people happen to be saying or what the stats say on paper. And the stats on paper say that Lane Hutson defensively isn't really all that great. You could even sort of make the joke, so to speak, that Macklin Celebrini, being the forward, is actually a better defenseman than Lane Hutson. How true that is, you can kind of debate, but the fact is that on paper, things don't necessarily look all that great. So in my opinion, that kind of gives Celebrini a bit of an edge in terms of play style. Then we move on to points. Obviously, Lane Hutson is the rookie leader in terms of points with his 41. Celebrini trails by 1 at 40. However, as we also know, Celebrini has missed a good chunk of games back at the beginning of the season. He is down 12 to Hudson. So he actually has a lot more points per game than Hudson does at 0.89 to the 0.73. On top of that, we kind of can talk about the makeup of the points actually being scored. Hudson does have 41, but it is only 3 goals and 38 assists. It is, of course, expected that a defenseman, and honestly most forwards, would actually have more assists than goals, simply because you can pick up 2 assists for every goal that's scored, so there's just more of them available. But having only 3, that is a significant gap. You're probably hoping for closer to 7 to 10 range. However, the NHL has moved away from just valuing goals so much more than assists because primary assists are viewed as extremely valuable as well. You got to give the credit where credit is due to the playmakers of the NHL. Think back to Joe Thornton during his true legendary years with the San Jose Sharks. He only had 20-odd goals, but he would have 90-plus assists that really put it over the top there. So how many primary points, which is goals and primary assists combined, does Lane Hutson have? He's got 19, which is just under 50% of his total point totals. When it comes to Celebrini, however, 17 goals with 13 primary assists gives him 30. That is 75% of his points being of the primary variety. And so he is making more of an impact on the points that he is actually getting compared to Lane Hutson. Now, it should obviously be said that not every secondary assist is made the same. So even though that Lane Hutson has 22 secondary assists, it's not as though each and every one of them is completely undeserved or he didn't make much of an impact. There are times in which you have to be a very good player and you set up a great play and you just so happen to be the second last or the third last player to touch the puck, and it's a very, very well-earned secondary assist. But on average, it doesn't have as much of an effect. And so while indeed that point scoring is higher for Hutson, it is more valuable, the points that Celebrini has put up. That gives yet another edge in his corner. However, not to say that everything is very straightforward here. There is one thing that Lane Hutson definitely does have going for him, and that is strictly because he is a defenseman. So him being 1 point ahead as a forward would be marginal, but as a defenseman, that is really, really good. And actually, if you take it into comparison, every other defenseman, not just rookie, but in the entire NHL, Lane Hutson is 11th in terms of points per game. Compare that to Celebrini against the rest of the field. For forwards, Celebrini has less than half the points of some of the league leaders in terms of forwards, and he is 52nd in terms of points per game. It should be noted that there are a lot more forwards that play, literally double the amount of forwards that play compared to defensemen. And so if you take like percentile wise, Celebrini's like top 12-ish percent, while Hutson is like top 6-ish percent. That is still a gap that exists. Hutson against the rest of the field from an offensive perspective as a defenseman is more impressive than Macklin Celebrini's current production. But there is one other thing that I do want to mention that I think really puts Celebrini over the edge here, maybe unfairly, but that is the fact that the narrative is quite strong here. I mentioned that it is not a objective stat that decides who wins the Calder, but instead a bunch of biased media members who may not have watched that many games. It's not any of their faults. You know, they're human. They can't watch literally every single moment of these games, but it is definitely the case. And so narrative-wise, it has a very, very big impact. Now, usually what exists for these media members is a West Coast bias. This is because a lot of the sort of core of the NHL finds themselves on the East Coast, and so you can tune in to a Lane Hutson Montreal Canadiens game at 7 p.m. Eastern and finish it out. But if you're on the East Coast and want to tune into a Sharks game, it takes place usually at about 10:30 p.m. Eastern. Many people would want to be in bed by the time the second period or at least the third period does begin. So you don't usually get a great opportunity to watch these Sharks players or Kings players or Ducks players on a consistent basis. And so if Celebrini were some throwaway third rounder who was having this exact identical season but kind of came out of nowhere, I would say that West Coast bias would play a very huge part. But Celebrini is the first overall pick, and that carries a very, very strong narrative with it as well. A lot of eyes are kept on what the first overall pick does in both a positive and negative sense, because if that first overall pick doesn't live up to expectations, a Jack Hughes, an Alexis Lafreniere, a Slavkovsky in their first season, I should say, a lot of people will come out and say, oh, that guy's a bust because this 18-year-old isn't lighting it up. But on the other side of the coin, when the 18-year-old does light it up, they get hyped up to the moon, whether it's Connor Bedard last season or it's Macklin Celebrini this year. Because he has been so great, that is just further amplified because of the storyline behind it. And you have the proof literally just last season with Connor Bedard, who I mentioned, hyped up as being the next Sidney Crosby. Connor McDavid didn't quite have that style of rookie season, but he was still rather good. 61 points. Like Celebrini, he missed a handful of games, so pretty close to that point per game pace. The runner-up for the Calder that season was Brock Faber, who had 47 points. That was also second in terms of rookie scoring, a 14-point gap between them. But what Brock Faber had as an advantage was being an incredibly strong two-way defenseman. Not only was he chipping in points-wise, but he was also very responsible in his own zone. He was like 6th in terms of all players in the NHL for time on ice. He was amongst the team leaders for the Minnesota Wild in terms of shorthanded time on ice. Really, really great in his own zone. So much so that this season, less than a year removed, he is the top pairing defenseman for Team USA at the Four Nations tournament. So all these things considered, that should have been a very neck and neck race for the Calder Trophy, where you could really make an argument either way. And yet, because Bedard was so hyped up, the offense being there, the flashiness, and being that first overall pick, he ends up with a pretty much landslide victory, almost 80% of the first place votes. Not necessarily saying the same will happen here with Celebrini, especially since Hudson plays in a slightly bigger market than Minnesota and is more of a flashier player than Brock Faber is. But still, the idea is simple, that because Celebrini is that first overall pick, there are a lot of eyes on him watching the incredible things he has done this season. So with all of these factors considered, I currently have Celebrini edging out Hudson just a little bit for that Calder Trophy victory. With that being said, had you asked me 2 months ago, I would have said that Macklin Celebrini was the clear-cut favorite for the Calder back in December, that he could have easily gotten like 90% of the votes if the voting had ended then. And a lot has changed over these last couple of months. And so over the next couple of months for the rest of the season, a lot more can change as well. And this actually works against Celebrini's favor. This is because in the case of Michkov and Wolf and Hudson, they are on teams that still have a lot to play for over the rest of this season. Yeah, the Canadiens and Flyers have slowed down as of late, but they are only 6 points out of a playoff spot in the Eastern Conference. And I already talked about Dustin Wolf being only 3 points out of the playoffs in the Western Conference. Compare that to the Sharks, who will be returning from this break a good 25 points out of a playoff spot. There's absolutely zero chance for them to actually make it. There's not a ton to play for. So in the case for these other teams, you have these 2 weeks break and you're ready to get back at it. You're ready to put your best foot forward and have a ton of effort, which can lead to more scoring, which can lead to more point opportunities for both Michkov and Lane Hutson. For the Sharks, you're coming back from this break and you're thinking, when's the next vacation over the last 25 games? And that can lead to more losses, more of a slowdown, and less of an opportunity for Celebrini to actually continue to keep up his point scoring pace. So we'll see how the Sharks are able to respond. We'll see how the team is able to do. It's going to be crucial for them to actually still put up some competitive fights if Celebrini does want to still find himself as that first place player come Calder voting time. But right now, he is my number one choice. Class dismissed.